Okay, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all here. So we are on LinkedIn Live predominantly. Please, for the session, if any interactions, anything you want to comments or questions, please put them on the LinkedIn Live event. Hello everyone to the first of our AI for Climate, AI and Climate series. And myself, I am Sharif Sayed Ali, co-founder of Nexus Climate. Just very, very briefly on Nexus Climate, we are a new organization, a new company focusing on scaling and enabling climate technologies, in particularly focusing on the MENA region and Europe, and particularly on technologies that are science-based. And very much that conversations around the uses and potential uses of AI for climate mitigation is why we're here today. There is obviously everyone has seen and heard so much about AI over the last 12 to 18 months. But there is a lot more to be said about it, and a lot more to be said about how it can be used to tackle climate, the needs for the climate crisis. And so today we have an amazing guest. And just before I introduce our guest, I'm just going to hand over to my colleague who is in Dubai at the Dubai International Financial Center in the Innovation Zone, just to say hello. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey everyone, welcome here to the DIC, and we're looking forward to this session in AI. I think we're a couple of us here in front of the DIC. The camera will autofocus, but yeah, we're looking very forward to hear Nantas talk us through the AI in climate.
Thank you very much, Jaap. And now I just have the fantastic pleasure to introduce Nantas, and a disclaimer here is that Nantas is not only an amazing researcher and engineer, but he's also a fantastic friend, and we have worked together for a number of years. So Nantas, or Dr. Nantas Nardelli, to be exact, he's really have a fantastic, distinguished background in AI research and product development. He's worked on many complex research projects at companies ranging from Microsoft Research to Facebook AI Research, 5AI, DeepMind, and most recently at climate tech startup Carbon Ray. And his specialization is in reinforcement learning and using that to master complex environments and using them for real-world dynamics. Nantas has his degree in AI from the University of Edinburgh and his PhD from the University of Oxford. So absolute fantastic pleasure to have you here, Nantas, with us today for our inaugural session. And I'll hand over the floor to Nantas now, and he's going to walk us through quite a bit around the state of AI today, how it's being used for climate mitigation.
Thank you, Sharif. Thank you for the kind introduction. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. So let me start by again introducing myself so that I give you a little bit more context about why I guess you should listen to me when I do this kind of talks. So as Sharif has indeed pointed out, I've studied at Edinburgh, where I started doing research in robotics. Sort of like I grew up before that as a kind of like as an electrical and control engineer, and then went to study AI and sort of like ended up more and more into sort of the deep maths of machine learning when I was there, which then led me to a PhD at Oxford, when I essentially sort of like started doing machine learning as as ML was exploding in popularity, particularly during the deep learning revolution. Sort of like I was at the right time at the right place to do really good things. While I was sort of like there, I basically worked in a bunch of top AI labs, doing primarily sort of like state-of-the-art research in ML and sort of like classic ML. But a couple of years ago, well, roughly 3 years ago, I sort of decided that climate really needed to be a focus of a career focus and a professional and a personal focus. and so I joined Cabruby, focusing on decarbonizing heavy industries like cement. I spent a couple of years there, sort of like as the machine learning lead, and now I'm joining. I'm sort of moving on to a new role in a stealth startup that I cannot talk about yet. But the emoji here is a hint to what I'm about to do. Still in climate, but it's sort of like in energy this time. So let's just recap where we are from the perspective of climate. So I'm assuming most of the sort of like people listening to this talk right now and watch this talk know where we are from a climate perspective. I'm just going to give a sort of like very high level quick overview. So we've been generating CO2 for quite a long time now. Just sort of humans tend to do stuff that generates CO2 as a process across pretty much the entirety of our sort of like personal and professional activities. During the Industrial Revolution, we have sort of sped that production up quite massively, and we have not just started generating CO2. We're generating a lot of different greenhouse gases across the board. But definitely, the sort of like the main one of the big problems that we have is that we've been generating tons and tons of CO2 across the board, and we've sort of like been accelerating in that generation pretty much forever, until maybe like a couple of years ago, where sort of like we've almost seem to have reached some kind of cap thanks to sort of like policy and technical efforts. Now, most of these sort of emissions come from sort of fossil fuel use across the board. Some of the emissions, although definitely come from the fact that we basically removed a lot of forests and sort of like replaced a lot of sort of land that was originally meant there to actually, be part of the sort of like ecosystem that takes CO2 and generates O2 and does all sorts of other things. But most of the emissions that we have been generating has come from fossil fuel, from the use of fossil fuel. So essentially, that's where most of us are now focusing onto tackling, onto making sure that climate change doesn't happen, and sort of the target is to get us to first stop producing CO2, but also to start taking some of the CO2 that we already produced across all of these decades and sort of remove it from the atmosphere. Now, if we don't do this, we're not going to be in happy times. Here you can see some data from NASA, from NASA Earth Observatory. You can see effectively the temperature change between, say, the beginning of last century and sort of the beginning of this century is quite dramatic. Across the board, we're definitely been increasing sort of like global temperatures quite quickly, and actually the change in temperature is also accelerating. So there's a very clear signals. All our models and sort of like observatories agree on sort of where we are, and pretty much this is a big problem that now needs to be attacked. Now, it is true that sort of like there's a general use of sort of carbon sort of intense resources that then ends up generating CO2 when burned. But different sectors create different types of emissions, and sort of we generally the biggest one for us is electricity and heat usage, like both sort of like low heat as well as like really high heat type of work. But generally there's a long tail of sectors that tends to sort of like add billions of tons to the sum. So it's sort of good to keep in mind what the ranking is, but in general, we want all of these curves to go to zero as fast as quickly as possible. If we do keep generating CO2, even like a small amount, things won't be good. So I like this quote from the latest IPCC report, which essentially is I like two things about it. First, that we need to urgently fix this up. But secondly, that we can fix it up. There is indeed an opportunity to actually still do things. Nothing is set in stone. We definitely sort of temperatures are increasing, and I'm sure everyone is aware of how hot the past couple of years have been. but definitely we can still do stuff. We have at least a decade or two of like really solid work that we can do to get to a point where in 2050 we are in a much better situation. So nothing is set in stone. We should really do the work. Now, where is it that I come here? So I've been working in AI for now over a decade, and a few years ago I said, screw everything. We really need to fix climate, and sort of like I spent a lot of time searching across the board, seeing what type of efforts were around that I could help with, and what sort of other initiatives were going. And to be quite honest, there weren't many. But in the past 2-3 years, AI has gone from being a tool that was useful in certain situations, but to something that is now sort of revolutionizing entire industries. And I think it's the momentum is now almost like peaking, and we are at a point where a lot of this technology is going to be transferred across many different domains. And it's a good time to learn what machine learning and AI do and what they are, and also sort of like to get a good understanding of where we are as a field from an application perspective. So what I'm going to do is very quickly walk through a few sort of buzzwords so that they're clear to people, and then I'm just going to go through what sort of like exciting applications of machine learning are across different industries. It'll be very quickly, and it'll be done very quickly, and I would like to be able to have a conversation with the current listeners as later in the Q&A, because I think there is a lot more that we can talk about. So the first thing that probably a lot of people have heard, but probably don't know what any of this stuff means, is transformers. Transformers are sort of like they're the kind of tool that is powering our current revolution in the field. I'm going to explain what they are, but I'm sure that people have heard all sorts of different buzzwords: RLHF, fine tuning, H100s, AI agent, etc., 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 etc. All of these have specific meanings, and they have sort of like more generalistic meanings, and I'm going to try and sort of go through the basics of machine learning, so that when you go off and read about these things, you have a general idea of what they're talking about if context is added. That said, I'm very happy to answer questions about what all this stuff means after the talk. So let's go through sort of like general introduction to AI. So in the sort of kind of like how we normally do things when we try to solve problems in computer science is that we have, let's say, an engineer. We have some domain knowledge. We do a little bit of software engineering, right? We come out with a program, and then the program is basically sent somewhere where it receives some inputs and it produces some output, right? That's generally how we've been solving problems in software since the sort of like the 60s and above. In machine learning, however, we do things slightly different. We kind of like flip this process from sort of like upside down. What we do is that we take the inputs and outputs that we've seen or that we have generated from sort of like actually writing things down, these pairs. We then take the domain knowledge that we have, and what we do is that we throw these two things at machine learning. So the machine learning as an output produces a program itself, like sort of like the software development process, but we call that program model. Okay? That model again takes inputs and produces output generally. Okay? Now, model sort of like machine learning can have different types of subfields. A lot of them have got confusing names, and they don't necessarily make a lot of sense until you collect the math. But sort of high levels are three big chunks of work that sort of like you can see in the wild. There is supervised learning, where basically a machine learning system gets given a data set of some input and output pairs. Let's say, for instance, you have a data set of pictures of cats and dogs, and you have associated a label that says in this picture there's a cat, or in this picture there is a dog, right? And the sort of machine learning process would produces a program, a model, that when given a new picture of a cat or a dog, produces out the label that is as a sort of like as a problem. You then have unsupervised learning, which is basically you take a data set and you want to learn some more information about that data set. that is contained within the data. I think this is a little bit more complicated to visualize, but imagine you're trying to take, again, the same kind of like cat and dog data sets that you had, and you want to figure out what is the distribution of colors in sort of like of the fur of the animals, and whether there is a difference between distribution of fur colors in cats and distribution of fur colors in dogs, these sort of things. You then have reinforcement learning, which is sort of like my own specialty here, where essentially you're trying to solve the problem of decision making, of autonomous decision making. What you're doing effectively is taking a problem where there is an agent that needs to solve a particular sort of like goal. It needs to reach a particular goal. We then give as an input to the machine learning system the sort of sensoring information, like images or sort of like the position of the arms that they're trying to control or whatever. And then you give it a signal that says you have done a good action or you've done a bad action, which we call the reward. The sort of reinforcement learning problem is the idea of trying to maximize that reward over time as the agent is taking the actions and is receiving more input from the environment. All of these three things are different kinds of machine learning. They fundamentally utilize similar systems to work across the board, but they're just slightly different problem statements that we all try to solve. Now there is also sort of like a fourth important kind of like label to be aware of. That is deep learning. Now deep learning is effectively a sort of like a subfield of machine learning where the models themselves, so they sort of like the architecture of the system, is a neural network. Now, effectively, you could have supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning problems being solved from a machine learning perspective, and each of these problems could use a neural network as the backend of that solution to sort of like to define what the model looks like. Now, if people probably have not heard necessarily what a neural network looks like, but effectively, it's sort of like it's a system that can be visualized in multiple different ways, and it has a history of confusing sort of similarities to sort of biology and bioinformatics and a lot of these fields. But I think none of them are very useful to effectively appreciate what they really are. So just sort of like very briefly, a neural network is effectively a thing that is made up of many different transformations, so operations that transform data, and it's sort of a system that stacks these transformations in a particular way, say from like left to right. You can see in the pictures, it's fairly sort of, it's hopefully a little bit easy to see. Like the data starts from the left-hand side, goes through a particular operation, then it gets transformed into another operation, and then so on and so on and so forth. The process of training these neural networks, which is sort of like what machine learning is doing. So when a model is basically being given the data, it needs to gradually be trained until sort of like the objective that is being given to the training process is sort of finalized. The way we represent sort of like a neural network and we train it is that you can imagine that each of these transformations is a sort of like an operation that has some weights, that has some parameters that you want to sort of like change to make sure that the operation is doing the right things. And the training process is just trying to find these particular parameters of all of these transformations. And you do it with respect to some problem definition. For instance, if you're trying to, again, with the cat versus dog thing, if let's say the model during training time is given a picture of a Labrador and it outputs the label monkey, then the sort of network gets told the parameters that you currently used to generate that output are wrong, and they're wrong in this way, sort of like, and sort of there are multiple ways to effectively get that training going. Ultimately, though, you can think about sort of neural networks and generally the entirety of the machinery of machine learning, of modern machine learning, as basically matrices that get multiplied against each other in sort of like a stack fashion. And the sort of like very interesting thing about this fact is that we actually have computers and sort of like computational systems that can run these operations really, really quickly. So these are GPUs. Sort of like if you ever heard the name NVIDIA, you probably know them. This is a very different model from sort of like the standard computational model that we use when writing software. It has been used in graphics, so there is some definitely a lot of prior work on this. But fundamentally, the ability for us to sort of design the sort of machine learning backend to work really quickly on GPUs means that we can scale sort of these processes really, really widely. We can make a lot of decisions very quickly. And when I mean a lot, I mean like billions, trillions of decisions across like the board. So when we talk about large language models and generally transformers and sort of like all of this stuff, you don't need to remember most of these things, but you just need to know that effectively large language models, which are what powers ChatGPT and what powers all of sort of like the sort of more recent AI stuff that has been becoming popular, is it just gigantic. These are sort of gigantic neural networks with like billions of parameters. They're trained for a very, very long time, and with a lot of data, effectively. And you can sort of like when I mean by a very long time, a lot of data, I mean petabytes of data and sort of like months of many GPU training time. And sort of that's been as the field has evolved, we're basically converging into this mode where the more data we have and the longer we train the sort of systems, the better they get at doing all sorts of problems. So the sort of classic AI problems that we've been using to make machine learning better are things like speech processing, computer vision, natural language processing, and all of these are like awfully well-known problems, and you actually have that in the past decade you've seen being solved in products as well. I'm sure people have noticed that now we can talk to computers either through things like Siri or OK Google. And we actually have systems that can like drive around cities just by using cameras, and we actually have chatbots that are wildly good at talking to us across a variety of sort of domains. That's obviously quite impressive, and there's been definitely a massive change all the way from sort of like 2012 to now in the past decades, where we were effectively not able to solve most of these problems. And we are now dealing with sort of like the more sophisticated aspects of these problems across the board. So the sort of components of these problems and why they're kind of were used in AI so far is they're very good to use as an excuse to learn how to do machine learning, right? So all these problems tend to have tons of data sets available across, and the internet is effectively being the sort of focal point of all this data being generated and be shared around. The second important thing is that there are very clear metrics that you can define to sort of evaluate whether your model is better than another one. Say, for instance, when you're doing speech processing, you can take a human and compare two different models and say, this model speaks better at English than this other one, right? Likewise, for computer vision, we can actually like take a video and we can say, oh, look, like the cat has moved from left to right. It hasn't moved from sort of like the bottom to the top. Therefore, model that does the correct thing is better than a model that doesn't. And with natural language processing, there's a similar story there. The other interesting aspect about this is that all of this data is actually in a form that we are, as a society, relatively expert in handling. There is data that also is potentially easy to collect and sort of easy to sort of like share around, but that we're less comfortable with handling. One that I was thinking about yesterday was, for instance, smell, right? There's a lot of data in society, we just don't necessarily capture it. But if we were to capture it, we will still not necessarily know how to capture in a way where it would be usable by now. And we're starting to kind of like work on this problem, but it's sort of like an interesting kind of aspect of human sensory making and sensory loads that we just don't deal yet with machine learning that well. Now, the flip side of this thing is that machine learning doesn't really work well in the case where, for instance, you have bad data, right? Let's say, for instance, you had your cat and dog data set. If your cat and dog data set contain, if a person has gone through the data set and has flipped sort of like a random amount of labels from cat to dog and vice versa, or has added like some random monkey in there, then the model that is gonna come out of there without knowing that that has happened is likely gonna be bad. So that is a sort of like a garbage in, garbage out type of process. The second thing is that even though we are very good now at doing things like data generation and, like, for instance, in natural language processing, like with your ChatGPT or your Claude or your Perplexity sort of systems, you can ask questions and you can sort of you can have conversations that are very, very good. But it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to ask things like, can you to these models, can you forecast what the temperature of London is going to look like in the next week, like with high accuracy? They're just not there. It's a problem that has different sort of like different dimensionality and different topology in a way where it's going to be it's something that the current systems don't handle very well as a rule. And then the second thing is that all of these models tend to capture things like correlation when sort of like predicting things, when sort of producing their outputs, but we don't have a good way to specify causality as a rule. So while, for instance, these models might know that when you find say a home with a family, it's likely that there's also going to be a dog in there. It's not necessarily clear to the model how the dog ends up being in the house, right? Things like that. This is a trivial problem, but generally, like there are sort of like more complicated systems that more complicated problems that we can't solve just because we just are not able to capture to really model what causality means. Now, in terms of like how we're sort of tackling sort of like the field, there are a few interesting things happening in the sort of like recently, and I'm going to try to cover a few of them very quickly so that you can start thinking about what can be done with machine learning now. So a classic example that has sort of been one of the older climate change uses of machine learning, even before the deep learning revolution, are things like satellite data and geographical data. So it's sort of data domain where there's a ton of data. We have companies like Planet, like Google, like OpenStreetMap. Like there are many systems, many sort of organizations that have collected years and years of historical data, both in terms of visual data as well as sort of physical data, like temperatures, like pressures, and things like that. And we've been needing to use them to understand how the health of our planet as a whole. And sort of as a machine learning community, we started to sort of tell physicists and that have worked on these problems for essentially centuries that we started to say, okay, you could replace some of the things that you've been cooking up with your software and with your mathematical models by just taking the data that you have and sort of like replacing or augmenting these systems with machine learning models. Again, a reminder from sort of like the first slide where we're talking about this, models are just programs. They're fundamentally the same thing. It's just not something that we need to program by hand. It's something that can learn from data. And so there are ways to effectively take some kind of like existing software that does certain things and just replace parts of it with machine learning models, as well as sort of like taking over the entire system. Now, so like one that I just showed is, for instance, the work that DeepMind did on very recently on forecasting, sort of predicting different kinds of weather systems, like sort of like turbulences and things like that. And they sort of there's a wide history of really complex systems that sort of have written in Fortran and have been they've been used historically by many organizations to predict the weather, which is something that we need to do as a society for many reasons. And sort of like what DeepMind did was say, okay, like we can just take all the data we have, train a big model, and that model, by virtue of training it with like useful in data for a long time and with like the right kind of tweaks, ended up being more general and more accurate in certain aspects than sort of this kind of programs that had all this know-how from thousands and thousands of people and like thousands and thousands of sort of like papers that were written on these things. We also have things like when we have geographical data, we can sort of like do more sort of like broader ecological analysis very easily by sort of like taking all these different modalities of data and putting them together and analyzing them using machine learning. One example is sort of like work that has been going on by the climate change AI folks, by some of the climate change AI folks, where you can very easily look at satellite data and sort of like figure out what the biomes of different systems look like and sort of like how they changes and vice versa. And you can, and that's very cool work. But there are also very interesting things like generally sort of health analysis of land use and sort of like social systems. There's an organization called MAP that, for instance, tracks how the Amazon or certain parts of the Amazon are doing from a deforestation perspective, and you can use machine learning to very quickly analyze changes in the system from imaging data. And there are places like NASA Harvest where essentially are trying to do the same thing for agriculture, for food productivity. Which is a massive problem if you're trying to deal with if you're trying to adapt into climate change, which will happen in some shape or form, and we have to be able to very quickly like analyze which kind of systems we need to change from across the stack. And agriculture is one of the bottlenecks that is sure to fail in some way or form. Now, another sort of like big example of things that are now popping off that people need to be aware of and think quite hard about is what's happening in the field of chemistry and sort of quantum chemistry, organic, inorganic, and sort of like all related across material science. The important thing is that by virtue of us learning how to deal with the modalities that we are very familiar with from a computational perspective, again, speech, videos, images, language, sort of text, we've actually started to understand how to use modalities that are not sort of like as trivially known to people. Things like, for instance, molecules or like molecule databases or so kind of like physical laws or things like that. Fundamentally, what's happening is that across the board, we've started to put together databases of properties of materials and molecules and atoms and sort of like different chemical systems. And as these databases have become more and more open, people have started to work on making prediction systems that can, for instance, they can, for instance, take some of the existing molecules and try to make a new one and then predict the properties of what that new molecule looks like. Vice versa, once you do these kind of things, you can end up sort of having kind of like a generation loop where you try different kinds of, you use different kinds of models to try different kinds of combinations of molecules, and you can end up sort of like optimizing for finding molecules that are interesting for your problem. For instance, you might find something that is able to bind with CO2 in a way which can capture it down, right? Which can sort of like take it away from the air. The interesting thing is that sort of like the top some of the top AI conferences, one of them is called NeurIPS. There's been a sort of like a materials design and sort of like AI for materials workshop for now the past few years, and that has become more and more popular. So this is a very exciting area of research that needs to be kept on. Like recently, across sort of like this kind of domain, there have been a bunch of publications that were sort of like kind of like they give a glimpse of what can be done and what is currently being worked on. There are things like simulating like sort of like quantum mechanical properties of like molecules. This is from DeepMind and from sort of the Livermore National Laboratory Lab in the sort of like Berkeley or Bay Area. They actually started making autonomous materials discovery through using a model, getting sort of like a machine to analyze to produce what the model kind of like as predicted, and then sort of like giving feedback to the model by creating new data and then having the data sort of like being confirmed and predicted and everything else. So it's very, very cool stuff. And it's sort of like this kind of like a increase in speed in discovery is something that is really, really quickly enabled by and sort of massively enabled by AI. The kind of a sort of like upsetting thing is that most of this work is within domains that are not climate centric yet, But there is work that is starting to sort of like emerge across sort of battery design and carbon capture and things like that from certain places. These are only examples. There are many companies that are starting to appear, and I fully expect that the next couple of years we're going to see an explosion in sort of like in efforts across the board. Going back to sort of like the original AgTech type of stuff that I talked about in the previous slide, it's this kind of example where I think it's important to keep to sort of frame the problem from the perspective of what can be done to sort of solve some of the issues that we have. Now we know that we need to sort of like make agriculture better to sustain sort of like to adapt to climate change, but also that if we don't make agriculture better, we are not going to be able to decarbonize sort of the system that produces CO2 across this sector. So ML can help across the board generally. If you need to sort of like make agriculture better from how it produces stuff, there are multiple avenues that you can work on. Very often, when you're trying to sort of figure out how to adapt crops, what you're trying to do is to develop new versions of this crop that can resist to different climates and different changes in climates. And that's a very important thing, that similarly to the materials kind of problem, you can effectively take that kind of process and we apply to AgTech, and it's sort of like a very similar system. And you can do things like, again, because now we are starting to get relatively good at chemistry, you can do things like also doing carbon capture by modifying what these crops are doing. There are a few companies that are trying to do this stuff, and again, there are more folks that are going to show up. I fully expect this to be an area of work, though, that is going to be underutilized because there aren't a lot of ML folks that know about AgTech or generally land use. And so this is a sort of problem where you need people from the domain going to talk to ML folks, releasing data and sort of like preparing problems that they can go and solve. Because it's one of the things that are not necessarily very sexy to work on, but that if you did work on them, you would find a variety of very interesting problems on them. And sort of like as an example, like robotics is also having a big explosion right now. Sort of like the augmentation and capabilities from the perspective of sensory information, like cameras and even control systems, actually are allowing us to get better at producing things. So robotics has always seemed like almost like a pipe dream. And obviously, I'm going to be a little bit careful here, but to not overhype where we are. But we are definitely at a point in time where the entirety of the AI community feels like robotics is going to happen in the next like 5 to 10 years as a general field across the board. There are obviously problems that are going to be harder to solve over time, but some of this stuff is actually significantly easier, and there are many people that are now trying to really like take a step of getting better at automating all these things. Now, as a sort of like final thought that I think is the sort of it's the real secret about why machine learning is useful for sort of like applications in climate change, is because when you try to do climate change, you're just trying to essentially do better engineering, right? You're trying to take this externality, which is CO2 production, that maybe you hadn't thought before as a problem, and try to say, okay, can we do the same thing that we've been doing so far, but with no CO2 production? So this is a very hard problem, right? So what you do is that you take a bunch of engineers, they try to come up with a solution that is probably approximative. The engineers test the solutions, and the solution has problem, and then they sort of like spin their wheels until the solution gets better. Now, we don't have a lot of time overall. This process tends to be extremely slow because it's bottlenecked by pretty much everything. Like, it takes time to generate new solutions. It takes time to test them. It takes time to like figure out that sort of like these solutions have problems. And generally, it's sort of like it's bottlenecked by all kinds of things. It's primarily bottlenecked, particularly by the fact that you need people to do all these things. And in principle, what you would really like would be to take sort of like the knowledge of the world and say, okay, we are in this state. We need to be in this other state. Computers should just like simulate the entirety of the world in the next sort of 10 years and give us the optimal path to fix climate change across all of these sectors. And that's kind of like where ML like gets you to go. So if you have a search problem, this would be combinatorially impossible. You would need like it would just not a feasible, tractable problem. But what machine learning allows you to do is it allows you to automate this learning problem, right? So you have this R problem. What you do is that you have probably some data that is associated with these problems. You go off and learn like an initial simulator from this data. Again, a model that makes some predictions or makes and a prediction could be what the next state given a particular action looks like. You then search using the simulator for a possible solution. Given that you have some metrics about how the simulation is gone and how the optimal solution looks like, you can again use the feedback that you've had from the search very automatically to generate either more data or to fix the simulator. And this thing can continue sort of like working until it gets significantly better than people. The important thing is that it's fundamentally automatic, and the only bottleneck here is really compute, right? If you the more compute you have, the more data you have, the more data you can generate, and sort of like the earlier you start this process, the sort of faster you can go at it, and better as well. So this kind of like data generation will is really the sort of the key idea behind why machine learning is going to be sort of like transformatory. Is because as a society we generate data all the time. Data is just sort of like an outcome of what we do, and the people and the sort of organizations that are able to capture this data and to use it to actually train ML models are going to be the ones that are going to beat. They're going to be ahead of the curve of everyone because the momentum of their sort of iterative process and the changes in their iterative process are going to be much quicker than if they've taken a bunch of people and thrown sort of like human capital at the problem. So an example of what we can do is if we do, for instance, like simulation and optimization really well, is that we can actually solve problems that now are like quite there would be like really transformative to society. Like this is a visualization of an automatic control system that DeepMind developed with a bunch of people at EPFL to control a tokamak, which is a fusion reactor. And fusion reactors have all sorts of problems, but that have to do with sort of instability of plasma and sort of like how difficult it is to sort of hold materials at like millions and millions of Celsius and at really, really high pressures. But if you have a simulator that you can co-design with machine learning, and you have an optimization system that they can learn off the simulator, you can end up being able to sort of like make progress on these systems by just being much faster at iterating on solutions that humans can do. And so, for instance, fusion people have been working on controlling plasmas in tokamaks for decades. And the DeepMind team and the EPFL team together were able to make a better controller that was less unstable and that had better properties for studying sort of like instabilities in plasmas much quicker than if you had taken like the same amount of people designing a sort of like a classical controller or instead. So that's kind of where I want to end it here. I guess I'm here to answer the question, and generally I would like to talk about this. I think the field is very, very early across the board, but we're definitely in sort of like at the beginning of a inflation in terms of capabilities. And generally, I love to talk about sort of opportunities in climate from an AI perspective. So just feel free to reach out. I'm even later. I'm definitely available. Thank you very much.
Nantas, thank you so much. It's been, as usual, just an absolute pleasure listening to you talk about AI and the opportunities in climate. And to be perfectly honest, like I've seen you give similar talks before, and and every time I'm just amazed by just your ability to be able to explain like very complex field in such a succinct and clear way. So thank you very much for all of that. We have a bunch of questions now from on LinkedIn, and please, if you are watching, if you have any questions, any comments, please put them straight on the comments on the LinkedIn Live event. There's a few that I'll get to. I mean, I will start with a couple of things I have in mind, though, if you don't mind. One thing is, I mean, I just kind of I feel like the magic really, if we can call it that, with AI and machine learning is that ability to simulate and optimize all sorts of systems, whether but including simulating materials, simulating the properties of chemicals, to fusion reactions, to industrial processes, and kind of thinking of the possibilities that we can do with that. And I guess what strikes me often is that how much, and you touched on that, is that in some fields, in some domains, it's not being used as much as it could be. And why do you think that's the case, and how could we change that?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the main problem is that everyone is busy. So ML as a field has been kind of blowing up, but we've been discovering more problems that we can solve. So there is some kind of like prioritization ranking system happening just naturally. And sort of the primary factor is data availability. So if you are let's say an organization that has a particular problem that they want to solve, let's say you are a cement plant, and you want to start reducing the amount of CO2 that you produce through the process of clinkerization. It's very hard for someone that knows ML to even know that this is a problem, and it's very hard for them to even start working on the problem because the data that is held in these plants is not publicly available. So step number one is definitely to evangelize the problem and to release the data in a way where it can be used by ML folks. So that's step number one. There are so organizations like Hugging Face and Kaggle that allow you to very easily host data and like sort of evangelize the problems as necessary, and it's relatively easy to partner with them, and it's like the easiest pathway to get people to work on the problem. Once people work on this problem for some time, you will see that the amount of baselines that sort of get created across the board will increase, and momentum will naturally gather.
So that's really I think really important point about kind of releasing the types of data that we don't usually see in the public domain, or at least available in some sort of curated ways, to make them available for the machine learning community to help solve those problems. I guess the big difference would be between, for example, you talk about cement plants or any industrial processes, that kind of data, which is proprietary by its very nature, compared to all the sort of linguistic data imagery that copyright issues pending, at least is available, widely available online, and can be gathered much more easily.
Yeah, and I guess that's actually an interesting point. Like, in a sense, a lot of this data on the internet did have, it wasn't public per se, but I think obviously with a lot of issues that still need to be solved, there's been a net positive gain from the internet just naturally aggregating this data together from different sources. I think a lot of organizations and industries just need to sort of realize that, yes, I think holding data is important from an IP perspective, but I think it's more important from an economical and climate perspective to actually release the data in a way that can be used quickly. Because you might be able to hire a bunch of machine learning people to work on the problem, but if you can release it publicly, you have access to thousands and thousands of people that might just nerd out on what you need to solve just naturally. A lot of the LLM sort of craze that has been kind of happening is really due also to the fact that a lot of organizations are releasing data publicly and are releasing models publicly, and people are just naturally able to just pick them up and make them better. And yes, you could grow an organization like DeepMind to solve a specific problem, but that's very hard and very unlikely and takes a long time. So the quickest, most efficient pathway is definitely to try to be sort of like data positive and data open.
Maybe a couple of points on this, and then I'll definitely get to the questions and the comments. But one is that I guess, yeah. So there's always the if you're a company let's say in a heavy industry, or in just kind of any sort of manufacturing or anything else, or in the built environment, maybe the first instinct say, okay, actually we'll hold on to our data. We'll maybe have a small team working on developing applications and so on. But I guess the reality, and we know from the big breakthroughs that happened in AI, whether companies like DeepMind or OpenAI or others, is that it's taken a very, very big team with huge amounts of expertise, huge amounts of computing to really get to those breakthroughs. So yes, you probably with a small team, you'll be able to do things, but really the breakthroughs require a lot more resources that are just simply inaccessible for a company that's not even operating in the software or AI space, right? And then so kind of I guess there's a balance of saying, okay, you could put out the data and then you will end up reaping more economic benefit overall.
Yes, exactly right. Yes, I think it's generally it's very hard in the current market to hire machine learning people, and I think you need to. I think it's significantly more optimal to try and exploit the fact that there are a lot of people willing to work on interesting problems in the open, either through academic groups or through their own free time, and if you look at the history of machine learning, that's really like how the community has been operating, will continue to operate for a long time. Computer vision, natural language processing, all these things weren't sort of like they weren't product focused until very, very recently. And there were decades of work just being done by the fact that it was just nerds trying to solve the problems by communicating openly about what they were doing. So I completely, yeah, I don't see any faster way and any other impactful way of doing this outside of like sort of like industrial partnerships, basically.
And the last thing on that is how do you kind of look at the just bringing in the domain expertise in that? Because as you mentioned, like if you work on machine learning, if your expertise is in AI, you very, very likely not to know the cement processes or kind of something else.
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think it's an important point to discuss. I think the easiest way to do this is to take the more computational ideation folks in a particular industry and put them to sort of like work on the data. For instance, again, taking the example of cement manufacturing has a lot of different people working on the process. There's a lot of process engineers, but some of them are sort of like they're more on the sort of like day-to-day job of managing the processes, and some of them are more on the sort of like day-to-day job of analyzing how the process is been going from a sort of like a technical perspective. I think the latter groups are the kind of folks that can be sort of like bridging the gap between the tech people that are going to do the modeling and the machine learning and the industry that needs to know what problems are useful to solve and what data is useful to give away and things like that. I think it's very hard to train people in machine learning unless they have a very sound understanding of a lot of technical software engineering and maths, quite frankly. But I think it's a very good pathway of doing this is taking people that are already sort of like experienced in computational methods and moving them to work with machine learning people, and sort of like this particular kind of like if there is an iterative process of learning in that relationship, I think things tend to accelerate much quicker than if you had only machine learning people working on the problem or only computational folks working on the problem.
So really bringing the machine learning expertise with the domain expertise and data.
Yeah, but I think it's very important to sort of look for people that already have a computational perspective on the problems themselves, because otherwise you end up not being able to talk the right language, and it's quite possible that you might lose time. Sort of like the two groups might not quite converge onto a useful problem to solve. And so I think that there's definitely a typology of people working in domain problems across the board that tend to be a little bit more amenable to selecting the right kinds of things to work on.
And it makes a lot of sense because you want people to be looking at things from a slightly similar point of view, as at least kind of having maybe somewhat of a shared understanding of the possibilities and the range of approaches.
That's right.
Very good, thank you. Well, so I'm gonna get to the questions now. So just one thing, maybe to start off. I mean, what do you see as, you covered a number of different possibilities, but what do you see as the single most exciting opportunity for AI in tackling climate change?
Oof.
Or maybe
That's a very...
you can pick 2 or 3.
Yeah. Okay. So my problem with climate change is I don't like the maths right now. So I don't like. I think that there are definitely pathways that we could, as a society, go through with the current technology to get to a state where we're at net zero. I think policy is very important and needs to continue putting pressure on sort of pretty much every system. But I think realistically, in sort of like even optimistic scenarios, we are going to be slower than we really should be. And so if you take that in account, then that means that from an energy perspective, we are not going to be able to generate enough energy to sort of like fuel the clean energy transition away from fossil fuel. We're not going to be able to sort of generate enough changes in materials in sort of like baseline industries like steel, cement, glass, et cetera. And I think that needs to definitely be a big focus. And I'm quite actually I'm quite optimistic in it's actually quite nice to see that the field, the machine learning, is actually attempting to go into exactly these fields. There is I think the best one so far, definitely that seems to have the right kind of trajectory, and that I think you can already see where it is going, is material science. There's a lot of work in health, for instance, that now is exploiting machine learning to do things like drug discovery, or generally just like better sort of processes to simulate new sort of biological reactions with drugs and things like that. And the same kind of systems can be probably transferred into material science quite neatly from sort of like a process perspective. So I think that's where I would put a lot of, if there is any capital available now, I would probably like try to kick that off even further than it is now. I think it's quite likely that as things are accelerating in biotech, you will see a similar acceleration in material science if more people were working on the problem, and there were sort of like, again, more problems, more data, more of everything. And then sort of that's the main thing. The sort of second thing is that I think fusion is likely to be accelerating soon. I think fusion has 2 problems. There is definitely a material science problem, as well as a sort of like physics problem. Like fusion is hard to model. I think ML is going to accelerate both of these 2 things. And I think even though we're always 20 years away from fusion happening, I think it might be quite possible that we're now at a point where we can accelerate the progress even further than they're already like quite quick sort of like change in performance for fusion reactors. And I think that will lead to us potentially unlocking that technology properly. But yeah, if I gave a top 1, it will definitely be materials.
Yeah, and I mean that. Yeah, and you've talked about this before, but I couldn't agree more on the just incredible potential for an AI for materials, and how that's because really, I mean, materials are everything we're producing and consuming, and in many ways, being able to have a step change in how we simulate, model, develop, and produce materials is going to be transformative, not just from a time perspective, but more generally.
Yeah, the important thing is that to kind of consider is that when you're trying to make new materials, you have this process that is very slow. You have to simulate the properties, and it takes like days with like really complicated software that can fail, and it takes a lot of people, a lot of brain power, and it's just slow, right? And I think it's these kind of industries are the ones that are amenable to the biggest breakthroughs by just saying, okay, can we take some of the bottlenecks that are like, say, your big PD solvers or your sort of like big computational systems, and actually learn something that then you can apply at scale much to actually accelerate all these processes. Like if you had a way to simulate the properties of many materials that you're studying really much quicker, instead of like being able to simulate a particular molecule interaction with another molecule over a day, you'll be able to do 1 billion of them. Like you could accelerate your discovery processes in like wildly, and I think the sort of where you have systems that use this kind of simulations, it's where I think you're going to see most of the sort of like soon you're going to see the gains from ML, because people are going to be aligning in making sure that they can remove these sort of like computational bottlenecks from the design process.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is I think any investors watching, this is definitely something to dig more into. It's I believe it's going to be a big part of the future of industry and of the climate transition as well. Amazing, and obviously Fusion is I'm personally incredibly I mean it's incredible. I mean, Fusion is we hope it happens commercially as quickly as possible. We don't often link up the two things, but the more freely easily available cheap energy we have, the more so many of our societal problems can be solved, and the more sort of really start getting into this idea of more resources available to solve more of the world's problems. So
and materials are also like important there, right? Like if solar technology and batteries are going to be another bottleneck in the next decade. Like we're doing amazingly, but like there's a lot of problems there, and I think companies like Northvolt are definitely sort of pioneering solutions that can help there massively. So across the board, I think that will be another big avenue. Definitely.
Yeah, amazing. Fusion and materials, amazing stuff. Okay, next question is there's kind of a few questions really kind of going around generative in LLMs, so we'll start with those. But before that, so there's a question around there's obviously everyone, every company in the world is talking about climate goals and the transition and all of that, but some are doing amazing work, some are really trying really hard and taking it very seriously, and unfortunately, as we know, there's also a lot of greenwashing. So the question is, can AI be used, machine learning be used to determine the veracity of sustainability data? So when you have this big kind of yearly sustainability report, for example, says we did all these amazing things, can we use AI in some way to say, actually, this is not quite right, or give it a score, for example?
Yeah, I think it's likely very possible that you can. I think I think it's possible. So machine learning is sort of AI agent systems are getting really good at going through a lot of data and summarizing it. I think there's a needle in the haystack kind of evaluation problem that the ML community is using to evaluate to test how these systems can look for specific information in large amount of data. Like, for instance, let's say you had a book and you inserted a random sentence in this book that had nothing with the book. Like a person would take a long time for them to find it, but an AI system that can read through the book very quickly should be able to, if it's optimal and well trained and everything, should be able to sort of query that information out. So I think we are likely going to end up being able to do these things. So the answer is definitely yes. There are issues, and I think the next speaker in the Nexus Climate Series, Sasha, will probably talk about these things. But there are definitely issues with bias and with sort of generalization that these systems have, where they might hallucinate, they might create sort of output that doesn't make any sense, that might still be visibly right. That might be just, for instance, they say you're going through the a bunch of different reports from corporates. They're trying to show that they've been doing some climate sustainability work, and they're all sounding very positive. This system is also quite likely to sort of be conditioned on that positivity and not necessarily give you what you want. Or it might be the opposite. It might be that a particular report is negative, and actually the report might be the reality might be better, and the models are conditioning directly from the text, and you're getting this sort of processes and these dynamics out. I think next year is when things like this are definitely going to start to pop more. I think it's just waiting for someone to try and tackle the problem. I think the systems are kind of ready for someone to experiment with them, and so it's again a question of aggregating all this data and making some kind of interface that where you can very easily test for hypotheses over this data. So
probably what today we can do lots of good data extraction from reports and so on in terms of doing more, I guess, qualitative assessment. That's going to take it's kind of a space to watch, maybe.
Yeah, I think aggregating different data sources is another big problem. I think that's, strictly speaking, harder. But if you're looking for summarizing information and for finding inconsistencies, I think you can start to do these things very easily and very effectively.
Fantastic. Okay, we've got a couple more questions. So one is, something that's been in the news a bit recently. Just kind of was reading one of the big names in Gen AI on the imagery side. Seems to have been scraping prompts and images from one of the other ones. So it's in the news today, so the question kind of really relates to that, but saying that how can you make sure that AI models don't end up self-referencing, creating a loop of inaccuracy?
Right. So it's not my area of expertise, so I'm gonna try and give my take, but I think it should be taken with a bit of a sort of like with some caveats. So a lot of people are working on synthetic data training. So kind of like many sort of top organizations are building big large language models. I kind of technically ran out of quality data. So they have a bunch of data sets that are like many sort of petabytes of data, and they effectively see in every book on the planet. And so what they're trying to do now is to use these models to generate data in a way where the models can continue training on this generated data. So it's not clear to me, and I think it's not clear to most people that these models will collapse once they see bad data, because there are ways to regularize the models in a way that you can say, for instance, this is synthetic data, this is real data. Make sure that you're very good at real data, and the synthetic data you can use it to like get better in expectation. So I think it's the community, I don't think, believes the model collapse will happen through synthetic data, but it definitely is a problem if when you're training, you don't know that a data is synthetic or not, right? And I think that's something that is currently unsolved, that is being worked on, rather. I think most organizations that are at the sort of like forefront of this particular problem have a bunch of hypotheses about how to solve it or whether it actually is going to be a problem. I think we're just going to have to wait and see. So that's the kind of issue.
And probably because it's somewhat of a fundamental issue for generative AI that it is being tackled and being looked at.
I bet people are very aware of the potential issues. Again, I think it's not clear yet that it is going to be a big one. But these models can definitely be weaponized very easily, right? You can there is all sorts of AI safety problems where you can introduce, again, false data, and the person that is fine-tuning this model can believe that the data is not false and can train the model in a way that leads the model to believe that the data is true. And then at that point you're in land of nowhere. Like you can funky things can definitely happen. Like one of the earliest LLMs, one of the earliest language models that were produced, they were given to the public a while ago by Microsoft, I remember, became really quite quickly racist by virtue of just retraining training on the interactions with people on the internet. And so things like that are definitely possible. And there are many safety groups at all these organizations trying to work these problems out.
Yeah. And so his final question is, to what extent are the recent developments in LLMs, Gen AI, a game changer for climate-related use cases?
It's a great question. So I don't know. So the issue with a lot of climate work is that, so from the perspective of technical problems, a lot of them are very different from the sort of the data availability. These problems is very different from the data availability that you have with language, right? Language, you have, again, petabytes of data that is very easy to scrape and very easy to parse and very easy to analyze, and if you look at weather data, that's significantly harder. However, I think the community has unlocked this sort of almost like natural law of information, which is more general algorithms, more time and more compute equals better performance over time. And I think that's something that pretty much now most people believe as being fundamentally true of how intelligence effectively works in these particular systems and develops. And I think that particular development is going to definitely carry out of LLMs. And I think that's almost more important than the particular architectures and particular systems that we've been using. Like that philosophy shift that originally was learn a lot about your problem and then sort of like design the machine learning system to exactly map to your domain understanding. That was what we were doing with things like expert systems in sort of like between the 60s and the 90s and the 2000s. And we are now in a world where instead we do want to know some stuff about the domain, but we primarily want to know that to condition the data, not the model itself. The model needs to be very similar, very, very, very general, and very powerful. And you just need to give it a lot of data and enough time for it to learn the right things from the model.
So if I replay that just to make sure I understand correctly. So is it that some of the LLM models, some of the algorithms that are being developed on that side of things, essentially there are capabilities that then could transfer over to other domains that are quite distinct from language as such, for example?
Yeah. So the sort of like the process of building these models is likely going to be similar across the board, I think, over time, as we again provided there is this data pipeline that is being generated. It's just that sort of like these models are, because they're trained on language data, I think it's very hard for me to say yes, they're going to be able to start forecasting the weather. Like they might in like say 5 to 10 years, I don't know, right? They might end up to be general intelligence where they can just look at a graph and like do the forecasting themselves. But I think that's in the realm of speculation. I think it's very hard to tell where we're going to go there. I think from the perspective of utilizing these models as they are trained directly to solve certain climate tech problems, I think that's less likely. But for instance, like if you look at organizations like Isomorphics Labs or some of the sort of like newer material science and sort of like chemistry labs, what they're doing is that they're taking pre-trained language models from natural language and then applying it to sort of molecular representations. Because you can represent molecules in text, you can sort of like reuse some of the concepts of syntax and semantics that the models have learned to do some operations on the text that then represents molecules. But I think it's in the realm of like less effective until you can have more kinds of data, more modalities of data inside these models being represented in the input space. So I'm not sure this is a good answer to the question. I think it's very hard to tell. I think the only way to find out is to do things, right? I think it's quite likely that across the board right now, if you were to apply what we have in terms of machine learning, you could probably get some important gains of your problem. But it's just a matter of committing to actually trying to solve the problem through data and machine learning.
Fantastic. Nantas, thank you so much again, though. So that was the last question. I mean, it's been absolutely amazing to have you both kind of the whole presentation and the talk on AI and applications and climate, and then sort of you're very generous also just time with all the different questions. I had loads, of course, as always, and from the audience as well. Is there, if you'd like to just any kind of closing remarks, perhaps?
I just want people to go work on climate tech stuff. So if you're considering working on climate tech and you're interested in AI, just go into it. We need more people to try more things to discover where we are failing from a technical perspective and where the bottlenecks are. My expectation is that there is a lot more low-hanging fruits across the board that we realize, and I think they're just waiting to be picked. So I think that's my call for people. If you have any questions, just come talk to me. Like, I'm very happy to have a quick chat about what you're doing and sort of like give you some tips on next steps from my perspective. Yeah, just any Twitter or email or web works. I'm also on Blue Sky, Mastodon, all these platforms.
You can't escape. Nantas, again, thank you so much. And just kind of reiterating your call, yes, more people working on climate. That's absolutely what we need. There's loads of opportunities, loads of startups that haven't appeared yet that will appear and will do a lot of incredible stuff. Again, thank you so much, Nantas. Here, Finances different ways of reaching him. Our next session is with Dr. Sasha Lucioni. Be also absolutely fantastic. I'm really looking forward to that too. And we're going to be really tackling some of the other aspects of AI and climate, particularly around the energy uses of AI, how we need to think about that, the positives and the negatives, and some of the ethical issues around that. So please do tune in. Find it on our LinkedIn page. I'll be posting about it on LinkedIn quite a bit as well over the next couple of weeks. Again, Nantas, thank you so much, everyone who's joined today or might be watching this later. Thank you for making the time, and please do reach out to Nantas, reach out to myself on LinkedIn anytime if you want to discuss any of this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take care.